Good evening, everyone. My name's Jenny Valentish. Thanks for joining us tonight. And thank you also to Greg Chipp, who is the driving force between Drug Policy Australia, for putting on this film to push the message of Support, Don't Punish Day. It's my great pleasure tonight to introduce you to Johann Hari, journalist and author of Chasing the Scream, the first and last day of the war on drugs. So Johann, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Hey Jenny, I'm so happy to be with you. We met years ago, and I really admire your work. So I'm so chuffed to be with you, and I'm really excited to be with you guys. And I love Greg, and so many of the Australian drug reform activists were there, who I suspect we'll talk about. So I'm so chuffed to be there. And I would kill to be in Australia, but to be honest, I would kill to be anywhere other than my flat in the time of COVID. So yeah, great to be with you.
Before Chasing the Scream came out, the average person probably associated the drug war with just a few things like, Nixon calling drugs public enemy number one and Bush's campaign, and maybe had an inkling that perhaps it was about, keeping down anti-war protesters and keeping down Black communities. But really, I think your book really educated a lot of us in more detail. But how did you figure out where to start? Because there's so many inroads that you could have taken.
Yeah, as you know, this is really personal for me. We had a lot of addiction in my family. One of my earliest memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. And I didn't understand why then. But as I got older, I realized we had addiction in my family. We still have addiction in my family, and it's very difficult. So I was on this big journey, writing the book, trying to figure out answers to these questions. And I started asking, well, why did we start going to war against people with addiction problems? So like exactly as you said, I thought, oh, Nixon, that's when it began, isn't it? So I'm doing loads of reading about Nixon. I'm like, but wait, this seems to go back earlier. So I'm going further and further back. And I realized there's this kind of really crucial figure, this man, Harry Aslinger, who's obviously you guys are going to see in the movie. Although he was much less hot than the actor who plays Harry Aslinger. You Google, compare the image searches, do a Google image search. But the, so I realized, okay, there's this guy, Harry Aslinger, who was he? I decided to go to his archives they're in Penn State University in Pennsylvania. So I go to his archives and they're huge and I'm spending a load of time there. And I notice in his writing, Billie Holiday keeps coming up. And I'm trying to make sense of who was this guy, who was Billie Holiday. And that's really where the trail to this story began. And I'm trying to piece it together. And I'm sure we'll talk in a minute about who Harry Aslinger actually was. But so I'm in his archives and I start just phoning around. So Billie Holiday obviously died in the 1950s. I just start phoning around and going to see everyone still alive who knew Billie Holiday to figure out why was this guy obsessed with Billie Holiday? How did they interact? And so I'm going through it and I'm getting fragments, but the picture's still not clear. And then one day I phoned someone, and this is a real lesson, any journalist in the audience. I almost didn't phone this person. He's called Bevan Dufty. He was Billie Holiday's godson. His mother, Maylie Dufty, was her best friend. But I almost didn't phone Bevan and the other godchildren because I'd phoned everyone else, but they were like children when she died. Bevan was, I think, 10. So I thought, what are they going to know? But I did it. And Bevan was he's a politician in San Francisco, kind of amazing guy. So I phoned Bevan and we started talking and we talked for and one of the first things Bevan said to me was, well, my mother believed that Harry Anslinger killed Billie Holiday. I was like, that's interesting. So we talk about that and we talked about an hour and I'm still thinking it's a lot of the story starting to fall into place, but I'm also thinking, well, okay, you were a child. And he said, I said, well, how do you know this, Bevan? And he said, well, my mother told me, but also she wrote part of a memoir. And I was like, oh, I haven't seen this memoir anywhere. And he said, well, no one has. It's in my attic. Do you want it? I was like, yeah, I'll have that. And really that was only a small fragment of a memoir. That was really the thing that opened up a huge part of the story. And I think just the lesson for me as a journalist is always phone everyone because you do not know who is going to be the person who holds the key that unlocks the story.
Yeah, absolutely. And yes, let's talk about Anslinger, because I would imagine that the war on drugs actually boosted an awful lot of people's careers. And so I'd love to know what his personal motivations were.
So Harry Anslinger was the most influential person who no one's ever heard of. He's a government bureaucrat and he takes over the Department of prohibition, under alcohol prohibition, just as alcohol prohibition is failing, right? It's been a catastrophe, as we all know, massively empowered organized crime, caused a lot of death. And so he's got this big government department with nothing to do. It's going to soon have nothing to do. There was a war on alcohol, alcohol won. And he invented the modern war on drugs. This is right back in the 1930s. He invents, oh, I haven't lost you, have I? You've
I
suddenly
can
screen
hear
has
you,
suddenly
so
gone
keep
black.
going.
Oh, great, perfect. So he invents the modern war on drugs. He's in fact the first person to ever use the phrase war on drugs, more than 40 years before Richard Nixon does. And he really builds the war on drugs around two intense hatreds he has. The first hatred he has is of black people. So Harry Anslinger was regarded as a racist, an extreme racist in the 1930s, which gives you a sense of how insanely racist he was. He used the N-word so often in official police memos that his own senator said he should have to resign. And this was one of the challenges we had in the movie. If you just put on screen what Harry Anslinger says, he sounds like almost absurdly wicked, right? He sounds like Captain Hook or something, like, and not that Captain Hook was a racist. I don't want to unfairly attack him, but evil. So you partly got the racism. The other thing that really drove him was an intense hatred of people with addiction problems. When he was the book is called Chasing the Scream because of an experience he had as a child. So when he was a kid, he grew up in a place called Altoona in Pennsylvania, kind of rural area was then, and he grew up next to a farm. He grew up on a farm, but the next farm down, there was a farmer's wife who had an addiction to morphine. And so when she ran out of it, she would scream and she would become very distressed. And one day when he was, I think, 11 or 12, he hears the screaming and he goes over to the farm, and the farmer there says to him, "Oh, go to the pharmacy in town and get her some morphine," because then it was legal. And he goes and gets her the morphine and he brings it back and it's given to her and she stops screaming. And Harry Anslinger resolves, boy, I'm going to wipe out drugs from the face of the earth. I'm going to stop addiction. And in a way, I think of that scream that he heard, he believes he's stopping those screams. In fact, he's increasing those screams. And in a way, massively increasing them. And I felt like I was kind of chasing those screams all over the world in the research for the book. So with Anslinger, he rebuilds and rededicates this government department. Bear in mind, at that time, most drugs in the United States were legal. Cannabis, for example, was legal. So he then leads these campaigns. He uses this huge government propaganda machine and builds great relationships with the press of its day and builds the case for a war on drugs in the United States. And then after the Second World War, imposes this war on drugs on the whole world, including on Australia.
Well, it intersects with racism so much so, doesn't it? I mean, the drummer of Billie's band has said, "We was going through hell. Miss Billie Holiday didn't have the privilege of using a toilet in a filling station." Another friend said she always ordered an extra hamburger and put that in her purse because she never knew when she'd next get served. And definitely Anslinger's, the way he pursued her was extremely personal in that sense, because I think Judy Garland was treated very, very differently. Like, he actually invited her around for a quiet chat rather than, raiding her place.
And it's fascinating that, this is very clear in the Anslinger archives and in his writing. So at exactly the same time almost, Anslinger finds out that Billie Holiday and Judy Garland both have heroin addictions. It always changes, I think, how you watch The Wizard of Oz when you know that she was on heroin the whole time, but that's a different question. Actually makes the movie make much more sense, I think. But so what does he do? You're about to see what he did to Billie Holiday, but it's not much of a spoiler to say he has her sent to prison. He ruins her life. He denies her the license she needed to perform anywhere where alcohol was served. With Judy Garland, exactly as you say, he writes a letter that I found in his archive to the head of MGM saying, let her take longer vacations, right? When Washington Society matron, of course, White, who he knew had a heroin addiction, he discreetly arranges for her to be given a heroin prescription. When Senator Joe McCarthy, his close friend, had an addiction to morphine, he arranges for a prescription at a pharmacy in Washington, D.C. No one has ever believed the war on drugs should be enforced against people they care about, right? That's I think about your own Prime Minister Bob Hawke, right, former Prime Minister, when he finds out his own daughter had a heroin addiction, becomes much more loving and liberal on drug laws and drug policy generally. So this is very deep. The drug war was always designed to be a war on them. It's never meant to be a war on us, right? So you think about the degree to which this is built on racism. I mean, you look at the early debates in the Senate and the Congress. It's incredible. When I started doing the research for Chasing the Scream, if you'd asked me why were drugs banned, right, back when they were under Anslinger and before, I would have thought, well, presumably for the reasons that if we stopped anyone in the street in Melbourne today and said to them, you know, why are drugs illegal? Most people would say, now this is, I'm not endorsing this, they're mistaken, but most people would say, well, we don't want people to become addicted and we don't want kids to use drugs, right? Which of course are goals we all share. But the war on drugs does not achieve that. But I would have thought, well, that was the purpose of it, right? What's fascinating is when you go back into the archives and look at this stuff, those arguments barely come up, right? The argument that was given very explicitly was black people. I want to be clear, I'm talking the way they would, not my views. Black people are using drugs. They're forgetting their place. They're turning on white people. We need to stop them having drugs to put them back in their place. There was also said about, it was Latinos, Chinese Americans, who Anslinger was also insanely racist about, and Black Americans. And this is the absolute, and these inequalities run not every society has the same level of racism as the United States, but every society where drugs are banned, drug use, even in quite restrictive countries, is so widespread. You couldn't possibly imprison everyone who uses drugs, right? So what do? It always becomes a pretext for the police to crack down on the people they want to crack down on for other reasons. Think about in Australia, you guys don't need me to tell you, Aboriginal Australians are, I mean, the figures are staggering for how much more likely they are to be imprisoned for drug offences. You know, I've seen people using drugs in wealthy neighbourhoods in Sydney. The police wouldn't dream of doing anything about it. They would never even encounter the police. So so these inequalities this is at the absolute heart of drug prohibition. Sometimes it's intentional, it's designed for this purpose. And even when it's no longer designed for that purpose, it continues to have that effect.
And it goes back a long way here too. I mean, if you think of the Chinese who came over during the gold rush era and the media campaign against them, and, you know, talking about opium use, it's very similar, really.
100%. If you look at, and this was very much the Anslinger played on this as well, this idea that that Chinese Americans were, or Chinese immigrants to the United States were bringing opium with them. This foreign evil contaminant. Drugs are always presented in Anslinger's kind of worldview as a foreign contaminant that's brought to weaken the United States by foreigners so they can prey on innocent Americans. And he would always, in his view, what he called the ultimate tragedy was always, he very often presented the idea that what would happen is Black or Chinese men would give drugs to white women, then have sex with them, and you'd have the ultimate tragedy of a mixed race child. So it's this really deep racist hysteria. And also you marry that with these insane ideas he had about addiction that are really there at the birth of the drug war, many of which persist. I think, you know, when I was in Australia, I really thought about Harry Aslinger. It was when Tony Abbott was Prime Minister. I'm sorry to remind you all of that terrible period. But I remember, so it was at the height of the legitimate concerns about the spread of ice at the time. I was watching the news and Tony Abbott said, with complete straight face, he's just listing the problems. He said that ice gives people superhuman strength, right? Which is a concept that was invented by Harry Aslinger, that he said that cannabis gave people superhuman strength, and it kind of skips from drug to drug. It's a sign of how removed from reality our drugs debate is, that your politicians can say that. Let's just stop for a second. If there was a drug that could make humans superhuman, that would be quite a useful drug in many contexts. Obviously, even just think about the meaning of the words. Obviously, nothing can make humans superhuman. We don't live in a Marvel comic, right? But so you think about these ideas, a lot of these ideas that are created by Anslinger about drugs, some of them he picks up from the culture and some of them he consciously invents. You have this. So he believed that addiction was contagious, and if you didn't suppress it, he compared people with addiction problems to typhoid Mary. So if you don't suppress it, aggressively suppress it, it will spread and infect the wider population. He was actually afraid for himself. He had very fragile mental health himself. He had long periods where he was off work because he became so paranoid and unwell, actually. So yeah, you've got these ideas that he builds are very deep, remain very deep in the culture. They may seem extreme now, but in subtler forms, they are absolutely laid throughout the culture.
So what actually happened to him? Did he at some point get succeeded by someone with a very different viewpoint, or did his legacy continue? What happened?
So he runs the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. The name changes, but we'll call it the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, from the 1930s right up to President Kennedy to 1962, when Kennedy finally dispatches him because he'd become a kind of embarrassment. He was so McCarthyite, and he was saying things like the heroin existed in the United States because the communist Chinese were flooding the country with heroin so they could weaken the US and invade it. So he'd become really a kind of ludicrous figure by the end. But he's replaced by people who continue all his policies, but just do it in a more polite way. And that absolutely continues, up to the present in many ways, right? So there's a line Harry Anslinger said I think about all the time. And it's one of the ways he imposed. So the drug war fails within the United States, obviously. So he says when he bans drugs, 1930s, he says, when we do this, drugs will disappear, right? They'll just vanish from the face of the earth. We won't have them anymore. And as you will have noticed, didn't work out that way. So he then says, well, the reason it didn't happen is because the rest of the world hasn't done it. And so they are attacking and flooding us with these drugs. So he said the solution is to get the rest of the world to do it. But most places just didn't want to, and refused when he tries to persuade them in the late 30s. But at the end of the Second World War, obviously the world is in ruins, and the United States, having taken absolutely the right stand against the Nazis, is by far the most powerful country in the world. So Anslinger uses that power to extort other countries to do it. So he basically says, if you don't ban drugs, you won't have access to our markets and you won't get any of our aid. So he goes to the United Nations, the new United Nations in Geneva, and lots of countries say, well, we don't want to do this. And he's sort of extorting them to do it. And the Thai representative at the UN said, but this isn't going to work, right? It hasn't worked in your country. We actually have quite good drug policies in Thailand. We don't have a big problem. And Harry Anslinger said to him, I've made up my mind. Don't try to confuse me with the facts. And I feel like that could be the slogan for the entire drug war. I've made up my mind. Don't try to confuse me with the facts.
Absolutely, yeah.
I can imagine Scott Morrison saying it tomorrow.
Yeah, I'm sure he has at some point. Over here, we've obviously got and in the UK and everywhere else, the Murdoch media actively stigmatizing drug users. I was wondering, what was the media doing back in Billie Holiday's day? Because I know after she got arrested, she actually did eventually enjoy a resurgence in her career. She's on TV, she's in Paris. I don't know if that was because of the controversy or despite it, but what was the press doing?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So Anslinger was brilliant at using the press. So let's think about cannabis, right? When he takes over, cannabis is not illegal. And he directly works with the Hearst newspapers, who were the kind of, Fox News, Sky News, whatever of its time. He directly works with them to promote these scare stories, many of which were just fabricated. So I'll give you an example. There was a young man in Florida, in Tampa, called Victor Licata. He was 21, and he killed his family with an axe. He hacked them all to death. And Anslinger seizes on this story, and he says, this young man smoked cannabis. That's why he hacked his family to death with an axe. This is why we need to ban cannabis, or you'll have an outbreak of axe murders. I'm not joking, this is literally what he said, across the United States, right? And Hearst newspapers, people would remember Hearst because it's the, William Randolph Hearst was the inspiration for the central character in Citizen Kane, Charles Kane. He should be remembered for like fucking up the world, but we'll leave that to one side. So he promotes these extreme scare stories across across the US, and this causes such panic in the population that they demand the banning of cannabis. Cannabis is banned, remains banned in many places today, although half of American states, half of the American population now live in states where cannabis has been legalized. It's an incredible transformation. So you've got the press feeding these hysterias. Billie is in this unusual position because Billie is a genius, right? And such a musical genius, I would argue a moral genius. And Billie, the power of Billie's music appeals to so many people that the press does smear her, say disgusting things about her. But you can't really overwhelm genius like that. When people can hear the music, you know, that overwhelms the attempts to smear and destroy. So she occupies this position where they're very racist about her. She was a recipient of racism all her life. Bear in mind, her grandmother, who she knew, who she lived with when she was a child, had been enslaved. Right, this is not far back. Sorry, her great grandmother, who she knew. So you've got this curious mixture where she's being demonized, but actually people are falling in love with her anyway.
Sorry, I just got slightly distracted there. So
I'm sorry.
Us who may just had a message come through.
The other day I was being interviewed on Zoom and literally a rat walked into my office. I was like, ah! So, and I was, yeah, so I empathize. It's okay.
Somebody walking in with no trousers. So those of us who live in a bit of a bubble of privilege may sort of be under the impression that the war on drugs is coming to a bit of a close. You know, we're seeing positive stories about psychedelic psychotherapy, about legalization, pill testing. So you can be forgiven for thinking, oh, things are winding down now. Is that so?
We're making progress, but the machinery of the drug war largely remains in place. Now, we should absolutely celebrate the progress that's being made. And there's some people in the audience, actually, who've done amazing work to get that. Greg Chip, obviously. Judy Ryan, absolutely amazing person. If, and this is a very American thing to say, but Judy, I know you're in the cinema, if you can stand up. You know, Judy is someone who, in her neighborhood, saw people dying with overdoses, didn't react by saying, drive these people out, shun them. She reacted by saying, what would actually help these people? And she led with her neighbors the campaign to build the first safe injection site in Melbourne. This incredible person. Fiona Patton, who's there. Jenny, you've done amazing work, and there's so many people in Australia who are doing amazing work. We absolutely, so I hope Judy and Fiona and everyone there get a round of applause. We absolutely should be celebrating that progress, which is very real and is saving people's lives. We just see the bigger machinery we're up against as we make that progress. So look at what, I'm not giving away much of a spoiler to say what happens to Billie Holiday, because I'm guessing you guys know, but Billie Holiday is sent to prison because she has an addiction problem. She's given a criminal record, and that criminal record makes it very hard for her to continue to do the things she loved. In Australia, in Britain, in the United States, that is what we still do, right? People, drug use is a crime. We give criminal records to people with addiction problems. We, instead of lifting them up so they can reconnect with the society, as they do in Portugal, Switzerland, Uruguay, and Canada, where I reported from for the book, instead of lifting people up with addiction problems, giving them more love, more support, more help, we shame them, criminalize them, stigmatize them, and punish them. And it makes their addictions worse. Sometimes people say, oh, the war on drugs doesn't work when it comes to addiction, right? That's true, but the reality is much worse. It's not that it doesn't work, it's that it makes the problem worse, right? Because the core of addiction, as you'll see with Billie, again, I'm not giving away too much to say Billie was horrifically sexually abused as a child. That's why she needed to anesthetize her pain. The core of addiction is about not wanting to be present in your life because your life is too painful a place to be. once you understand that, you can see why inflicting more pain on the person makes the problem worse, right? It's like adding fuel to the fire. So I think we need to understand this wider context. There's also, by the way, there's what we do to drug users and people with addiction problems. There's whole other layers of harm related to the war on drugs. For me, that actually, although you can, as I'm sure you can tell, the addiction question is very close to my heart. There's an even bigger form of harm we do, which is when you transfer a massive trillion-dollar industry from licensed legal businesses to armed criminal gangs, that creates an enormous war for drugs that has killed, at a conservative estimate, more than 1 million people, right? And kills people in Australia. I remember when I was in Australia, there was a guy who was chopped up in Wollongong by rival dealers. This kind of thing happens. You get violent war for drugs in Australia, just like you get it everywhere else where drugs are banned. So, but I think the most important thing to hold on to is that tension between the progress and the remaining machinery. Because the single most important lesson of the film you're about to see, from my point of view, is none of this had to happen. Right at the start of the war on drugs, there were loads of people like Billie Holiday, there were doctors, there were scientists who said, this is not going to work. This is going to kill people with addiction problems. This is going to empower the worst criminals in the world. We don't have to do this. There are compassionate, loving alternatives we can choose instead. And they were not listened to then. We didn't hear Billie Holiday. We heard her music, but we didn't hear her message about that. And as a result, untold numbers of people died, and untold numbers of people had lives that were less than they could have been. We don't have to carry on with that. This struggle you're about to see between Billie Holiday and Harry Anslinger, that struggle continues today. You have this model embodied in Billie Holiday who said, we need drug policies based on love and compassion. She said, I just want help. And everyone like me just wants help. And then we've got the drug policies based on Harry Anslinger's ideas, which are based on hatred and shame and punishment. And all over the world every day, people listen to Billie Holiday, and it makes them stronger and it makes them wiser. But all over the world, with a few exceptions like Portugal, every day, although we don't think we do, we still listen to Harry Anslinger because we enforce the war that he introduced. And it makes us weaker, and it makes us sicker. And at some point in this war, we have to let Billie win, not Harry.
I've just got one last thing to wrap up with, Johann. I was wondering what kind of a legacy Chasing the Scream has been for you. I mean, you went on to write Lost Connections, which in a way, it's a follow-on. And I don't know if it's, have you got a book on focus coming up next year, did I see?
Yeah. I want to come to Australia, but I think I'll probably kill you all with the plague, so I better not. But yeah, it is coming out, yeah.
So has this created a new space that you're going to be sitting in for a bit, or, about mental health and well-being and looking at the current structures we have and how they can be improved?
Yeah, I mean, this is really close to my heart and it's really important to me. But I think for me, the thing that's been so moving about this book, for me, the experience of writing it and then traveling all over the world talking about it, is being part, like one of the little tributaries that runs into the river of reform, right? And I think so much about, I mean, Australia is one of the places I felt really profoundly moved, because I'll just tell you, if it's okay, just one story. It'll take a second, but I think it's worth, a lot of people will know this story, but I think there's a great Australian hero I got to know who I think helps us to understand how we can all take this forward. And it's such an honor to get to be like one little dot next to someone as amazing as this. So Alex Wodak was a doctor in King's Cross in the early 1980s. And he was one of the first doctors to realize that HIV/AIDS had arrived in Australia. He was seeing people dying with it. And quite quickly it was figured out, okay, this is a bloodborne disease, a bloodborne virus. And okay, so we know what to do with it's spread through blood and semen. So we know what to do about the semen element of it. We know, so they started distributing condoms to gay men and to sex workers in King's Cross. So they start doing that, and it's very effective in reducing transmission among them. But at that time, no one knew what to do about injecting drug users, right? There had never been any needle exchanges anywhere. So Alex, some people in the Netherlands were having this idea around the same time, but Alex, who worked in one of the Catholic hospitals in the Catholic hospital in King's Cross, has this idea, well, why don't we give them clean needles? Why don't we distribute clean needles? And at the time, people say, this is absolutely ridiculous idea. These are drug addicts that don't care about their lives. They don't want to live. They're killing themselves. You'd just be facilitating drug use. Don't do it. But Alex thinks, let's try. So a coalition of the sex workers who they were helping with the condom distribution and the nuns who worked in the hospital fan out across King's Cross, and they do one of the first ever needle distribution programs in the world. And this is and the police arrive and they say this is a crime. It was a crime under the drug paraphernalia laws in Australia, and they said you must stop doing this. And Alex said, but these people deserve to live. And even if you don't think these people deserve to live, which is a terrible thing to think, this could be the entry point for HIV/AIDS into Australia, because of course drug users have sex with people who are not drug users. This could kill huge numbers of people. We must do this. And the police kept threatening to arrest Alex and punish him and arrest him. And Alex kept on doing it with these nuns and these sex workers. And finally, Alex was called to see the Premier of New South Wales. There's a meeting and there's loads of them there, and the police and the public health minister. And they say to him, you must stop doing this or you will be arrested. You could lose your medical license. You could go to prison. And Alex thought about, his parents were Holocaust survivors. And his parents survived because some Dutch people hid them. And that's why they lived, and that's why he got to have the life he's had in Australia. And he thought, sometimes you have to stand up to people and sometimes you have to do the right thing. So he said, you know what? Arrest me, put me on trial. I'll explain to a jury of 12 ordinary Australians why I'm trying to save the lives of these people, and you can tell them what you're trying to do, and we'll see who prevails. And Alex walked out of the meeting and he got in the lift, and the public health advisor got in behind him and said, whatever you do, don't stop. And the police backed off. And that program was one of the first pieces of crucial scientific evidence that established that needle exchanges massively reduce HIV transmission. That model has spread to many parts of the world, and it has saved millions of lives. We'll never know how many lives it saved, but at a conservative estimate, millions. There are times in life when you have to be brave. And if you are brave and appeal to people in a spirit of love, it can lead to profound transformations. I would just urge everyone in the cinema, when this is finished, go and talk to Greg, go and talk to Jenny, go and talk to Judy Ryan, go and talk to Fiona Patton. Find out how you can be part of this fight. We can end this fucking war. We can end it. It is hollow. It has been a catastrophe. It's led to disastrous outcomes. It does not have to continue. There are much better alternatives. I've been there. I've seen them. I know what they are. You know what they are. We can fight for them. And every person who joins the fight brings the day when this war ends closer. And every day it comes closer, more lives are saved, more lives of people like Billie Holiday. So I'm really proud to stand with Greg and everyone there. Thank you all for all the work you're doing. If you're not part of the fight yet, please join. And please read Jenny's new book as well, which I'm really psyched about, Everything Harder Than Everyone Else. And I'm really chuffed to be with you all. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much. Enjoy the film, everybody. It's a beautiful, beautiful film. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll have a quick break now.
Oh, hooray.
I think we're all right. Yeah. Probably still
We'll not embarrassingly go, we'll say something really offensive and it'll be broadcast in the whole cinema.
I'll just check that. Hang on. We definitely off? Maybe. Not definitely.
Let's not say anything too offensive in case.